The shadow of Huggin, Molly. It was a cold autumn evening in the small town of Abbeville, Alabama. A dense fog had rolled in, shrouding the narrow streets and casting eerie shadows through the ancient oak trees that lined the town square. Legend had it that this fog signaled the return of Huggin, Molly, the mysterious and ghostly figure who haunted the town. Molly's tale was well known among the townsfolk. She was said to be the restless spirit of a grieving mother who had lost her child long ago. Some whispered that her mind had twisted in her despair, transforming her into a sinister presence. Now, she roamed the streets of Abbeville at night, searching for someone to embrace in her bone-crushing hug, a hug so tight that it would leave the victim gasping for breath, paralyzed by the icy chill of her touch. Most locals avoided the streets after dark, but 17-year-old Jackson dared to defy the old superstition like many of us would. "It's just a story," he'd say to anyone who'd listen. That evening, he decided to cut through the old cemetery on his way home from a friend's house of selecting his team for fantasy football. He was extremely stoked since he was certain to dominate the league this year, so he was dismissing the fog as nothing more than a freak weather pattern. As he made his way along the overgrown path, he barely noticed the silence around him grew thicker. The fog swirled lazily, blurring the headstones and twisting the silhouettes of the trees into grotesque shapes. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine, and he paused, feeling the prickle of eyes watching him. "Just the wind," he muttered under his breath, shaking off the unease. He continued his pace, but the eerie sensation only grew stronger. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound behind him, like fabric dragging against the ground. His heart pounded as he turned around, peering into the swirling mist. There was no one there. He chuckled nervously and turned back, but his relief was short-lived. From the depths of the fog, a dark figure began to take shape. It was a tall, looming shadow, draped in a long black cloak. Her face was obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but Jackson could feel her eyes boring into him. And then, before he could even think to run, she moved, gliding silently toward him. "Who's there?" Jackson shouted, trying to show defiance, but his voice betrayed him by trembling. But the figure didn't respond. She only reached out with arms impossibly long, her fingers thin and bony. Every muscle in Jackson's body screamed at him to move. But he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror he couldn't explain. Closer she came, until he could see the edges of her tattered cloak fluttering in the breeze. Jackson stumbled backward, finally breaking free of his paralysis. But it was too late. With a speed that defied logic, she lunged forward and wrapped her arms around him in a crushing embrace. Her grip was like iron. He gasped, struggling to breathe as her long fingers dug into his back. The cold of her touch seeped into his skin, freezing his blood. He tried to scream, but the sound was choked off as she squeezed tighter and tighter. He could feel his ribs groaning under the pressure. Then she whispered, her voice a low, haunting murmur that sent shivers down his spine. "Don't be afraid, child. I just want to hug you, forever." With a final, wrenching squeeze, everything went black. The next morning, Jackson's parents found him at the edge of the cemetery, unconscious and barely breathing. He was rushed to the hospital, but he never spoke again. When he finally awoke, his eyes were vacant, and his body would go rigid at the mention of a hug. The doctor said it was shock, some kind of trauma that had broken his mind. But those who knew the legend whispered a different explanation. Huggin, Molly had found him. And though she hadn't taken his life, she had stolen something far more precious: his sanity. Now, every foggy night, a new rumor spreads through the town of Abbeville. They say that if you wander too close to the old cemetery after dark, you might hear a faint whisper, feel a chill down your spine, or even catch a glimpse of a tall, dark figure with outstretched arms. And if you do, run. Because Huggin, Molly is always looking for someone new to hold. Forever.